No one will have a bigger impact on the future of the United States than the person we elect president. But have you ever wondered why news coverage of the campaigns focuses more on the candidates' personalities than it does on their stands on the issues? Join Dr. Lee Artz and me today as we examine the 2020 Democratic primary from a standpoint of media framing. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Lee Artz. We're going to talk about media framing, and Dr. Artz has published several articles and book chapters over the last 10 years on media framing, and today we'd like to apply that to the Democratic primary because we've got a lot of interesting issues going on there. Lee, before we get into the details on how this is affecting us, let's define media framing for our viewers.
Yeah, it's a long tradition in media studies, and part of it is that the way the media frames a particular event enables the journalist to define the event, to diagnose the causes of the event, to make an evaluation of the participants, good or bad, which then justifies whatever the action was. And there's a variety of techniques to help that media framing, including relying upon certain sources, including whatever the descriptors are to define those particular sources, and an almost complete lack of context. With those things combined, it means that the media can actually give objective, factual news, but it frames it in a particular way. It's as if I was looking out a window and what I see is true, but if I turn this way, what I see is something totally different.
Right.
So this may be trees and a bird, and this may be grass and a squirrel, but depending on how it's framed, I get a totally different understanding of the events. And media framing, commercial media framing in particular, does that on almost all events, which really handicaps public understanding.
Yeah. For instance, we might say that that even if someone's trying to be objective, there's always a level of subjectivity in their communication. So a reporter might be trying to objectively cover an event, but the reporter, by choosing that event, right, by choosing the language in which to describe the event, if it's broadcast, the camera angle, all those things, frame it in a way that even though we're hearing what might be some objective facts along the way,
and sometimes
change the context.
Yes, and sometimes there isn't any particular intent to frame it in a particular way. But for instance, the Soleimani assassination, the New York Times and most commercial media relied almost exclusively on U.S. Pentagon, U.S. administration sources. And they quoted them accurately, and they were able to have a little map of where the missile went down. But that was how they framed the story, as a U.S. response to a threat, which, as it turned out, there was no threat. But by the time we realized that, the framing has already created a certain understanding of that.
So in terms of the election and the primary, one of the framing issues is age.
Yes.
Another framing issue, for instance, if you look at Elizabeth Warren, and I don't want to get into this just yet, but just as an example of framing, is the discussion about, is she electable? And here she's trying to represent certain issues and get some discussion going on those issues, but the coverage of the story, while it's not inaccurate, right, is focused on, is she electable, and will people elect a woman, and and things like that, which are not really ideally what we want to be voting on when we're trying to select a president. So,
and it's possible for people to understand that that's taking place, because there may have been stories in the previous election with Trump that featured his age, but I don't remember that as prominent. But now it is quite prominent that Joe Biden's this age, Bernie Sanders that age, Elizabeth Warren is that age. I mean, the Mayor Pete thing has made that he's too young. So there's a focus not necessarily on the policies or the proposals, but as you say, the frame is the question of age and wisdom and
and I think we need to acknowledge, age is a legitimate issue here, but I don't know, is it the main issue? In terms of the age, though, I made a note on this. So Elizabeth Warren's 70, Trump is 73, Biden is 76, and Sanders is 78.
Yes.
And they're arguably, this is the oldest group that's ever run for that office. And there's a lot of discussion going on about cognitive abilities and what changes when you get to be that age and things like that. But I mean, how relevant is it? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think it probably depends upon the individual. I mean, there was a
Yeah.
woman that just died yesterday, Kathleen Johnson, which was the black woman that made it possible for the U.S. NASA to get to Mars and do the first Apollo.
Right.
She was 101.
Right.
And she was sharp all the way through her 90s. So, and I don't know when Grandma Moses started painting, and she's a historic American artist. So she was, both of them were creative and had cognitive abilities that had no relation to their age.
Certainly, historically, a lot of people that were very successful.
Yes,
into
so,
writing. William Wordsworth was still writing poetry.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that the larger question would be is what is their cognitive ability? How do they respond to certain questioning? How do they understand?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
If we're going to explore that.
Yes.
But the bigger issue is what are they going to do if they get elected? Wouldn't you say?
Right. Yes.
And so while it's relevant, I mean, maybe it's not maybe it's not.
No,
what we
I
should be
mean,
voting
again,
on,
it's what we were saying before about framing. It's factual. It's accurate.
Yeah.
The question is, why do we want to look at that more than the immediate statement? I don't think there's anybody that's looking at the debates if they watch or look at the press coverage that don't understand these are old white people. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So, okay, we said that. Why do we have to say it again and again? But that's one of the techniques in framing. By repetition, by featuring, by giving prominence to something, it raises its level of importance and suggests how the media wants us to look at that issue. In this case, rather than looking at the policies, they want us to look at other things. Age is one of them that is probably less prominent recently than it was a few months ago.
Yeah. I remember historically when George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, declared his campaign for presidency in '68. He was the first Republican to come out against the war in Vietnam, said he would pull the troops out if he was elected. And they asked him, why the change in your position here? And he, describing what had happened, he had apparently, as a senator or a governor, had visited Vietnam and had been toured around by the military, right? And told that, we're winning this and, we're doing all this good work over here. And he came back thinking that was his view. That was the framing that he got from those tours, right? Yep. And then, he claimed that after he got back, he was talking to veterans and he got a very different story. And so when he was explaining this at a press conference, he said he was brainwashed when he was in Vietnam, right? And, brainwashing today, it's a common metaphor for somebody, talked you into something that maybe you shouldn't have believed, right? Well, apparently when he used this term, people took it literally. And he spent the next week explaining what he meant and eventually dropped out of the race because
they were afraid
brainwashing became the frame of his campaign, right? Yeah. And he couldn't get past that to talk about what he wanted to do as president. Ended up pulling out of the race. Right. That's the most ridiculous example of this that I can think of. But certainly the first time I thought it was that apparent. So right now, how is framing impacting the Democratic? Because the Democratic primary is what's most interesting right now.
And as we go forward, it becomes apparent to most people, even reluctantly, I would argue, to the commercial media, that it looks like Bernie Sanders is winning large majorities of the voters in these primaries. And I think we could probably agree, most people would agree, that there's a divide among the major media in the United States. There's a section of the media that quite obviously is supportive of Trump and his policies, like Fox News, Wall Street Journal, Breitbart, some others. And then there's another section, again, I would say quite obviously, like the New York Times or MSNBC, that are opposed to Trump. There's that division, and sometimes it's the blue and the red, conservative and liberal. The surprising thing to me is the commercial media across the political spectrum is united in their opposition to Bernie Sanders. So you have on MSNBC, you have Chris Matthews saying, if Bernie gets elected, they're going to execute people in Central Park. I mean, this is their position. The New York Times, this week, there's been two editorials, Charles Blow and David Brooks, both wrote editorials on how Bernie's election would be a disaster for the American economy and the American people. So The Wall Street Journal had a thing that was repeated in the New York Times this week also, that Bernie is a pro-Cuban, pro-Castro anarchist. Again, that means America will burn is what was the suggestion. And that's across the political spectrum, which I think is an indication of the commercial media framing of this election. Bernie needs to be stopped. Anybody but Bernie. That is and that requires, I think, some conversation and some questioning of why would they kind of have a unified view of Sanders, especially after he's getting, close to 50% of the vote in the recent primary in Nevada, and going forward, he seems to be winning in almost every poll that takes place. So why would the media continue to frame this as he's not electable, he's too old, his policies aren't supported by the American people? And this is from the ones I mentioned, were not from the conservative media, but this is from as liberal as the commercial media gets. Yeah. The New York Times and MSNBC with Rachel Maddow. It's incredible the framing they have, which is not to say someone should be for or against Sanders. It's just interesting to look at the framing and the process that's carried out. So
and I know in Nevada he had twice the vote of the next two candidates.
Yeah, almost half of the vote.
So I did find an article that kind of goes against this, but I think it helps us get into it. So this was New York Times, and this came out shortly after Nevada. And the headline, the first sentence, the lead is, Senator Bernie Sanders won big on Saturday and is now the clear front runner. And then the two paragraphs down, it starts off with, Mr. Sanders did not just win in Nevada, entrance polls show that he dominated. So, obviously, there are, when we say the media, there are many voices, right? So when you're
not
talking
as many as you might think.
Well, okay, but still, there are certainly people who don't agree with one another. So what we're talking about is a tendency for them to fall into line, to form a kind of a consensus on how they're going to frame things, even though they might deny that they were forming a consensus on who they wanted to support or not. So this often happens at a subliminal level, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think it goes farther than that, because, I don't think it's the intent of any particular journalist. But when you talk about a framework or a structure, yes, across the commercial media, their interest is in selling either newspapers or attracting audiences so that they can be sold to advertisers. That's their primary interest. The second thing is
I'm sure every reporter's aware of that. You're not going to work for the Washington Post and write an editorial.
That's correct.
And expect to keep it. In fact, I know this because I was editing a small newspaper right after I got out of college, and I endorsed Jimmy Carter for president and was let go a week later. And nothing was ever said about my endorsement. But I always wondered if that didn't have something to do with it.
Possibly. I wouldn't say it's as direct as that. I would say
mine, I think was.
Well, in your case, maybe. But in most cases, the reporters, by the time they get to write for the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, have internalized the values of what is a legitimate source, how should we frame this, what are American interests, what are the interests of our publishers.
And there's a consensus about those legitimate sources and all those other things. And there's the dominant framing force.
Well, even on the level of, if you ask a hard question of the president, you may not get the pass to go into the next press conference, so you can't ask the question. Therefore, you're of no worth to the newspaper or the TV show that you're working for. So you know that your questions even have to be kind of softballed in order to get an answer that you might be seeking.
And the PR staff now checks that in advance and makes sure. And if the Kansas City Star sent you to cover the presidency and you don't get an interview, a couple interviews every year, you're probably going to get sent back to Kansas City.
That's correct. That's correct. So I would say it's more just than the commercial media. It certainly goes way beyond the intent of any particular journalist, but they have internalized some of these values. And more importantly, the sources that are relied upon.
They're all the same sources. This is the Entman book, right? Robert Entman talks about how, especially when it comes to covering foreign policy, reporters have to interview an expert, and there's a small pool of experts. It's ambassadors, former ambassadors, pretty much all educated at Georgetown University, right? And they're without them agreeing on anything advanced, there's a consensus about how they view the world and the U.S. role in it, right?
And everybody that's the expert, whether they're an official or a politician or an academic expert, has that consensus. So no matter which source I go to from that side, I'm going to have the same thing. The difference in this case, though, is there is no particular source in the coverage of the Democratic primaries. There's not like an official source outside the DNC, but beyond that, the interesting thing to me is that the wide consensus that Bernie Sanders is a threat to the American way of life. It's not just in the editorials, it's also in the news coverage.
Well, and I think the underlying issue there with Sanders being a threat is that he's declared himself a socialist.
Yes.
And, we went through the Cold War thinking that, socialists were in league with the devil, basically, right? So what's so scary about socialism? What do you think?
Well, the first thing I would say is that many of the journalists have internalized that. They've been raised in universities, they've been raised in the same media environment that demonizes socialism, equates it with communism or anarchism. That would be the first thing I say. The second thing, I think that this is a hangover from the Cold War, where anything that was seen as a threat to the United States interests, broadly written, was considered socialist. So it was easy to demonize the Soviet Union or China, because even though they had a planned economy and the quality of life might have been okay, there was quite, it was Stalinist, it was autocratic, it was repressive. So nobody wants that.
Not that we're saying the quality of life was okay in China during the Cultural Revolution here, right? We just
No, but 20 years before the Communist Party decided to introduce capitalism, and they are, I mean, there's well over $200 billion of U.S. investments in China. I mean, General Motors sells more cars in China than they do the United States. China is a capitalist country.
Absolutely,
But the difference is that there's a Chinese Communist Party that wants to continue to wear the mantle of Chairman Mao and the rest as they're introducing capitalism, as they're introducing advertising, private property, and the rest. So,
and the issue is that it's a totalitarian government, and that's not synonymous with
certainly not with socialism.
Capitalism or socialism or communism or anything else. Right?
The interesting thing too is the socialism that Bernie says he is. He always points to Denmark or he points to Sweden. Recently there was a thing about Cuba, which we should talk about. But when he points to Sweden and Denmark, those are capitalist countries.
Absolutely.
They're social democratic countries that have free health care, free education, parental leave, a decent standard of living.
I mean, technically, the U.S. is a socialist country because we're providing services that are paid for by the government, right?
Well,
I mean, if you eliminate all socialist aspects of our lives, right, everything would be commercial. Right?
He wants some basically modest reforms that aren't largely different than Roosevelt's New Deal. $15 an hour wage, Medicare for all. These are not radical proposals he's making. Maybe have a more graduated income tax so that the rich pay a little more. The interesting thing to me is the commercial media and the Democratic Party are all in a tither about this man that says he's a socialist getting this support.
So are we kind of saying that they're reacting to the word socialism the way they reacted to the word brainwashed in 1968?
I'm saying they're using the word socialism to try to get a reaction from the American public. They know that he is not.
Well, that would be the same in '68. I mean, it was a attention-getting.
What it used to
headline.
be called was red baiting. So I don't have to talk about your politics. I just will accuse you of being a Stalinist agent, or I will accuse you of being a terrorist in contemporary terms, which means I can avoid discussing the policies. But even in the midst of that, the latest YouGov poll in the fall of 2019 says that, listen to this, 70% of millennials, people aged under 30, 70% are in favor of socialism rather than capitalism.
Because they weren't indoctrinated by Cold War rhetoric, right?
Also because they've recognized what capitalism has brought. I mean, we right now are on the verge of extinction because of the use of fossil fuels. We have 3 people in the United States that own as much wealth as the half of the population. 3 people. People live precarious existence. Despite all the claim about the economy doing well, There's large numbers, almost 40% of the population that is right on the level of poverty. Suicide in this country is higher than it's ever been across the demographic, whether we're talking about young people or old white farmers. Their experience with capitalism is that it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for the public, it doesn't work for social services. So when somebody like Sanders, and I don't think he is a socialist, but when somebody like Sanders comes along and says everybody
you don't think he's
should...
a socialist like Castro was a socialist.
Yeah, well, I don't think he's a socialist. Like, I don't think that he proposes that there should be a referendum in the United States on who should make decisions about production or who should control the wealth in this country. He says he's a social democrat or a democratic socialist, which is a very mild thing. But even at that, again, MSNBC says he's an anarchist. He's going to burn America. This is the liberal television news that raises this red baiting flag.
Well, you know, media is business-based, and you know, like any other business, they have to appeal to customers, and as you're saying, I mean, people under the age of 30 have a very different view of this, a post Cold War view of it. You know, isn't it inevitable that news media is going to have to shift that frame as that group becomes more and more influential on deciding what they're going to watch, and therefore, you know, creating value for airtime on these shows?
Yeah, the question will be if the frame is shifted simply as a reform, or if it's shifted where it actually allows some democracy, some decision making by the public. Yeah, they're a business. Media are an industry. Yeah. They're a business. So yes, they need viewers, which is the spectacle, which is why in most of the debates, the people that are asking the questions are trying to stir up some controversy rather than asking questions about policies. They need that to sell papers and to get viewers. At the same time, they're an industry that doesn't want a change in the way tax, ownership, licensing, production is done. And if Warren or Sanders or even some of the other candidates were able to implement a thing that says there should be a graduated tax, maybe return to capital gains tax, well then the profits of ABC and Disney may be affected. So yes, they want to have viewers, but they're not going to go so far as to undercut their business model.
It's hard to see that as a mechanism that's dictating a particular story. But if I could just skip away from that for a second, it seems to me that Sanders and Trump have one thing in common, and that is that those are the two candidates who are least willing to play the game. If Sanders wants to talk about an issue and he brings it up, and you see him do this in debates all the time, they'll ask him, you know, what do you think about your lead over Biden in Nevada or something, right? And he wants to talk about, you know, Social Security. He'll say, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about Social Security, and he'll change the subject.
This is one of the...
It seems that Elizabeth Warren has been less... She said she was going to do that, but she's been less effective at changing the subject to what she wants to talk about. And Trump, of course, just ignores interviewers all the time.
I would say that you are channeling one of the media frames on presenting Sanders to the public. Yeah. And that channel is that there's this populist that's a Trump and a populist that's Sanders. It's actually in the New York Times editorial yesterday.
Well, my point, though, is he, you know, are Sanders and Trump a little bit better at asserting their agenda because they're more willing to ignore the frame? That's my question.
Well, certainly, but the way that Trump avoids it is to make personal attacks, racist attacks, and ad hominem it, right? He doesn't get to policy. He's going to talk about
I mean, but we're talking about how the media frames issues here, right? I mean, so one of the ways that you overcome that is by opposing it on this meta discursive level where you're just saying, I reject your authority to frame the issue. Here's what I want to talk about, and you just start talking about it. So it seems to me those are the two candidates who most often do that, and it seems that they're the ones that seem to be getting the strongest reaction from the public, right? For different reasons in terms of what their politics
well,
are.
I think that's important.
But they both seem better at opposing the frame.
Yes, well, certainly Sanders, again, I don't think that he's a socialist, and I think ultimately he's going to end up supporting the system as it stands. But what he has done is he's opening a conversation that there may be a different way to organize society. There may be a way to meet people's needs, not profits of insurance companies, for example. That's the threat. And that is true. He hasn't stopped from that in any of that time during his campaign. And that, I would argue, that's one reason why he's gotten such broad support. And it also is one reason why there's still confusion about his overall policies, because he's been attacked by the media, which a response to his supporters is he's being attacked by the media unfairly, which actually builds more support for him. Ultimately, the media will have to come to the conclusion, if he continues on that track, what are you going to do? And you kind of have to reach that point where they're going to have a different kind of coverage, particularly if he got the nomination, which is still questionable at this point. But if he did get the nomination, the media is going to have to find a new frame to present him.
Yeah, and just as he's been trying to force new frames on them all along. That's all the time we have for our program. I want to thank Dr. Artz for joining us today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.